Karen, if I'm allowed to call you Karen. So I don't know if maybe some of you will remember, maybe some of you won't. It's just about a year ago. I was here with a gentleman named Fritz Sprandell, who was an adventurer. Was anybody here for that talk? And the sad story is the world-renowned adventurer slipped on the ice in February and hit the back of his head. And adventurers and people can be stubborn. Who's stubborn in here? I am, right? He wouldn't go to the hospital. And it turns out within 24 hours, um, he was in a coma. And we lost Fritz in February of this year, slipping in his own driveway. So it's a sad story about him. And I know many of you were, gracious when he was here and asked him questions. And he was very happy to be here and shared his story. But I'm going to get into my story a little bit. But it does involve Fritz at one level. So first of all, back in 1982, I started a limousine company in Allentown. And over the years, that company had its ups and downs, but I'm still doing that business today, by the way. And over time, I met like a lot of celebrities. And celebrities, most of them are wonderful people. The problem is they're always in the spotlight, so they always have to be on, and we can sometimes think they're testy. But maybe 15 years ago, I was at a family reunion. I was sharing a little bit of this with the people in the back who won't come in the room. Just kidding. Anyway, these little kids were running around, and I'm going to say they were 8, 10, 12 years old, and they would come into the pavilion for a cold drink. And I would say, do you know who Mammy and Pappy were? Now, Mammy and Pappy Kemmerer were my grandparents, Minnie Mae Kemmerer and Alan Kemmerer from the east side of Allentown. And they said, who? And I remembered, okay, they're probably 3, 4, maybe even 5 generations down, so they didn't know. So you don't have to answer this question, but I'm going to ask you. Just raise your hand if you know either set of grandparents' names. Keep your hands up if you know their parents' names. So we got 2 in the back, 3, 4. You guys are the exception to the rule because over 90% of people out there can't tell anyone their great grandparents' names. So after I was thinking about that, it kind of got in me like, man, this life we live and the path we take really determines who we are, but who's going to remember it? So I started writing down my life story. Again, this is like 15 years ago. And my story was full of, we drove Gene Simmons from Kiss, and I took him for sound check one time, and this was at Stable Arena. If many of you from this area might know where that is, back in the day, that was a big venue. And I was about 15 rows deep, and there's nobody in the arena, maybe 15 people getting ready for the concert that night. And all of a sudden, from stage, I'm back there, and he goes, you! And I think he's pointing at me, and he starts yelling, stop the music! And he's like mad. I'm like, oh my goodness, what did I do? Here a guy stepped in behind me with a telephoto lens and was taking a picture of him without his wig. And he didn't anybody know at that time he was bald. Now we all know today he wears a weave, but I thought, oh my word, this lead singer from Kiss is going to remember me for whatever I did wrong. So anyway, there was a lot of celebrities that we drove over the years. So when I started writing my life story, it was full of who I thought were these really great people, and most of them were, that I met and the experiences I had and things like that. And, I was writing it I'm still not done with that book. And coming back to Fritz, I met Fritz when I was 10 years old, but didn't remember that. And if you remember the story, great. And if not, it's really not that important today. But later in life, when I was, it was in 2008, I was 48 years old. I took a job. I had sold my first transportation company, and they said, what do you need? And I said, cars and drivers. And they hired these drivers. And one night, this guy comes back, and he says, yo, boss, what are you still doing here? I said, I don't know, something about the work ethic. My dad taught me back in the day down Hamilton Street. And he looks at me, and he says, you're Reds' kid. Now, not many people called my dad Reds, and he had just passed away. He was only 67. He passed away about a year before that, so it was really fresh in my heart and my mind about my dad. And I said, "Yeah, I am Reds' kid." And he said, "Don't move." And he went to his car. If you heard this story last time, I apologize. And he got a manuscript of the first book he wrote about his canoe trip that wound up putting him in prison in Cuba. And he turns to a subchapter, and it says, "Reds comes through." And it's about my dad. You know, I told you I met him when I was 10, but this was the story. I went with my dad to work at the service station at 10 years old. And my job was like put the oil cans out and window squeegee buckets and things like that. And my dad, who never cursed, started yelling, "Jiminy Crickets, what the hammerheads, freaking Fritz." You know, I'm like, "Dad, what's going on?" And he says, "Fritz tore all those flags down and he's using them in the park for a blanket to stay warm." I didn't know anything else about Fritz, but that was a childhood memory I had. So when he goes to his car and he gets the manuscript for his book, Reds Comes Through, it's the flag story. And the comes through part was my dad had a heart of gold. And he put a car between the gas station and at that time the bar, the ale house in Allentown was in the alley next door, and that's where Fritz hung out. And he put a moving blanket in there and said, "Hey Fritz, if you need somewhere to sleep, sleep in here so you can stay warm." So I automatically, kind of like took a liking to Fritz and who's this guy and what's he about? And that really was the first pivotal point to my life story about a bunch of celebrities and making money and all that stuff, where it turned more in for me. So Fritz and I kind of, he worked for me for a long time, and we had a relationship, and we worked on his books, and we actually are still filming a documentary and things like that. But getting to know Fritz, it really made me think about my dad. And a lot of people ask me, "Why did you put so much time and effort into Fritz and his story?" And really, it was about my dad. Fritz reminded me of the kind heart and the kind person my dad was. I may have forgotten that, at least to the extent that I know it today and knew it as a child. So that's what kind of really pulled me in with Fritz. And then what happened, fast forward to the pandemic. Now, I've been married, it'll be 39 years next month. And but during the pandemic in 2020, I had to let everybody at my company go, including my own daughter, and lay her off. And we were in transportation, nobody was traveling. So I would go to my office every day, and I would sit there and I facetiously say cry and say, "What am I going to do next?" And I was, exploring options. And then I would stay a couple hours, make sure the building was secure, nobody robbed it, and I'd go home. Now, my wife watches our grandchildren just about every day. She has at least one or two of them. We have 4 grandchildren. But during the pandemic, what happened? You couldn't see anybody. She couldn't see the grandkids. So we would sit there in our house and look at each other, and I would think, "Oh my goodness, who is this woman, and where does she come from?" We didn't know each other at the level. I was 7 days a week I was working. So Fritz started it sitting home. I read a book a long time ago, Stillness Speaks. When you're quiet, stillness speaks. That's when God does most of his talking. The problem is, up until that point in my life, I had a lot of success. And I thought, look what I did. Look at me, 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 me. I wasn't listening to the message. Now, backing up just a little bit, when I was born, by the time I was 1 year old, I had pneumonia 3 times, and they couldn't figure out why. So they decided to go down my throat with a bronchoscope and see what was going on. There has to be something in his lungs. And my heart stopped. And they couldn't start it. And they walked away. And the one nurse that was left behind, now obviously I wasn't even one, so I don't know this firsthand, but I heard this all my life growing up. My mother and my grandparents. And the one nurse that was left behind to kind of, do whatever they do, she says, "Doctor, we have a heartbeat." Now, they told my parents, "Doug will never be able to take a gym class." He's not going to be right. Now you understand why I'm so goofy, okay? But he'll never be normal. He won't be like the rest of the kids. He won't be able to take a gym class. He won't be able to study and things like that. So fast forward, I went to Union Terrace Elementary School in Allentown, and in fourth and fifth grade, they had intramurals in spring. And in fourth grade, I was the fastest runner in the fourth grade. And I couldn't understand why. I could still see him standing over here as I crossed the finish line. My mother and my grandmother standing there just crying, right? Fifth grade, fastest runner in the fifth grade. Well, now when I went to school, I'm getting a little old now, so it was a long time ago. But when I went to sixth grade, in Allentown, they had a thing called the sixth grade center. All the sixth graders went to the central school down on Linden Street around 8th. And in spring, they had intramurals. Fastest runner in the whole sixth grade. Now, I'm not saying this because I'm special or I'm great. I'm just saying this is how I started understanding the blessings that God can share with you and allow you to share in. So life goes on. In 1980, 81, a friend of mine was in the Coast Guard in Alaska. They tried to rescue a fisherman, and his chopper went down, and all 4 guys in the chopper were killed. Now, does anybody remember the air traffic controller strike back in like 81, where the air traffic controllers went on strike? You couldn't fly planes almost anywhere. It was hard to. So right here from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, John Snyder was my friend that was killed, and his dad was John Snyder also, and he worked for the Bethlehem Steel. He got a flight, and he got into Kodiak, Alaska to the base, but he couldn't get back. They couldn't get flights either from Kodiak to Seattle or wherever it was, and they kept saying, maybe tomorrow, maybe tomorrow. And, it just kept getting pushed. Well, I'm very naive. I wish I was still somewhat like this today. I'm calling the president. So I picked up the phone and called the White House. I said, I'd like to speak to the president, please. It was President Reagan. And the girl kind of chuckled, and she said, well, it just doesn't quite work that way, but what's your situation? I tell her a friend of mine from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania was killed in the Coast Guard, and explains, she says, I'm from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Whoa. God wink or what, right? And she says, I'm going to get somebody to help me. So if I can't speak to the president, now, honestly, I was so naive, I didn't even know who the vice president was. It was George Bush, the first Bush, I guess. And can I speak to the vice president? She says, it doesn't work that way. I promise someone's going to call you back. Now I'm working for my father at the service station, fixing cars and pumping gas, right? And I tell the guys, hey, listen, if the White House calls, it was a reaction just like that. Yeah, oh, okay, Doug, we're on it if they call, right? So about 15, 20 minutes, half hour later, I'm out front pumping gas in the car and cleaning the windshield, and the mechanic comes walking out. Someone from the White House is on the phone for you. I said, I got to take that, right? So this name was embedded into my mind, and I'll never forget it. A guy named John Gong, Gaughn, and that's how I remembered his name. I would spell it when I say it. He calls me back. And the long story short is he says, I'm going to help you. And here's my home number if you have any problems. And he asked me my home number. And a couple hours after that, my friend's father is on the base in Kodiak, Alaska. And the commander of the base comes to him and says, I don't know who you know, but I just got a call from the White House. And if I don't have you and your son home tomorrow, there is what to be paid. They were back here landing at ABE the next afternoon, so the son could get a proper burial here in Bethlehem. Now, one of the things I've thought about all my life is I didn't understand the size of that. Like, I tried to call the White House a couple of weeks ago to see if I could get John Gong's email because I wanted, he's in the book, right? I can't even get a return phone call, right? So I often wondered, there's several things in my life where I just did things, and I don't know where the energy or the thought process, well, I do know, right, where it came from, but they're just like really, out of the box. So I've thought about that story all my life. And of course, these are all in my first draft of my book. And then my wife, Debbie, who was not my wife at the time, this was like 1985 maybe. Willie Nelson was performing at the Allentown Fair, and I had a contract with the Allentown Fair to drive the celebrities, at least some of them. And we didn't get a call for Willie Nelson, but we got a call for Bobby Lee Nelson, which was Willie's sister. She was the piano player, and she just passed away a few months ago, to pick her up at ABE. So I go over to Allentown at the airport to meet her. There were no cell phones yet, right? But just to meet her, and I had to go to the fair first and meet the road manager, and he gave me the backstage pass and the flight information. Go over there. Everybody comes off the plane, and she don't come off the plane. So I go to pay phone and call the backstage number at the fair and say, hey, I'm here. I can't find her. I'm really sorry. 15 minutes after you left, she showed up on the tour bus. She got off a plane in Pittsburgh and caught the bus coming in. No problem. So I go back, give him all his information back. He says, you're excused for the rest of the night. So I left with the backstage pass and called Debbie up. Now, Willie Nelson's her favorite singer in the world, right? I said, Debbie, this might sound weird, but put some cowboy boots on, a nice pair of jeans, maybe even a cowboy hat, because she had all that stuff. I said, we're going to see Willie Nelson. So like many times before, I put her in the back of the limo like she was, somebody. She is somebody, right? And I knew the procedure. Blink your headlights, toot on the horn. They open the gate behind the stage. You pull in, park the limo when we're supposed to park. Let her out of the car like she belongs. And we walk up on the backstage, and we're standing this close to the harmonica player the whole concert. And we stood there, respectful, didn't do anything we shouldn't do, just acted right. When it was over, I put her back in the limo and we went home. So that, I don't know where that came from, but I did that. And so all these stories are neat and they're fun and all that. So there's a woman here today with me named Bathsheba who's in the back of the room. And I found her through a referral when I needed to write some stuff about Fritz, including the treatment for the story. And she helped write the Finding Fritz book, a snowmobile book, and we cleaned up some other projects for him. And at one point, I said to her, I've been writing my own life story for a long time. It's nothing like the Fritz story. I wasn't, put in jail in Cuba or anything like that. She goes, well, send it to me. I'd like to read it. So I sent it to her, and a couple of weeks later, she goes, yeah, your story's pretty interesting. I said, yeah, it's nothing like Fritz. So we kept working on the Fritz project. And now keep in mind all this time, it started with Fritz and then COVID. I'm really searching in. Oh, and one of the things I figured out, I had this property, but we had no transportation. But where I'm located was a car lot for like 20 or 25 years before I got there. I said, I've always liked cars. I grew up as an auto mechanic. I should sell cars. So during COVID, it took a while, but I opened a car dealership, used cars. And shortly after I opened, this couple comes in, and they're a husband and wife, in their 50s. And I could just tell they were nice people. You ever bump into people on the street and you're not sure if you want to talk to them, but then you meet someone else, you're in sync. Like in this room, I can almost feel the Holy Spirit. Like there's a connection here or something, right? It's a warm environment. They were just nice people. And they bought a car, and when the thing was almost done, they said, by the way, we're pastors at the Trinity Wesleyan Church right here on Citronia Road, which is like a mile or less from my office. I said, oh, that's nice. It's interesting. I was born and raised in the church. Both my grandparents were pastors. But that doesn't get you anywhere, right? That's nice. She says, yeah, and since you like cars, we have a car cruise the first Saturday of every month during the summer over at the church. It's open to the public. It's free. People just want to show off maybe their antique car or whatever. Just so happens my wife's brother has a couple collector Thunderbirds, and he had a stroke. He can't drive. Perfect. Can I bring my brother-in-law's cars over? Absolutely. So we talk about they call it the car cruise. And turns out something came into my heart, and I said, hey, I'd like to sponsor this somehow. He goes, well, there's really no cost, I said, well, is it like family oriented? And he said, why don't I send an ice cream truck If the show is from 4 to 7, I'll send an ice cream truck from 5 to 6, 1 hour, it's on me. He said, well, that'd be great. So they advertised free ice cream. I'm not complaining about this. The first week, the ice cream was like $224. By the end of the year, the last one, it was like $1,200 because. And then if I say, wait, you got to give tickets out. They got to at least have a ticket. But everybody was coming for the ice cream. So how many people in the room have ever heard this statement? God works in mysterious ways. Amen. So after the thing's over, the last one, they also did it like a trunk or treat in October. The pastor, I don't remember if he texted or called, but he reached out to me and he said, we would like to give you a recognition for helping to sponsor the car show. Do you think you could come to a church service and we can recognize you? Now, in all honesty, I hadn't been in a church except for a wedding or funeral in over 10 years. And I was born and raised in a very strict environment. I wasn't even allowed to play Little League baseball on Sundays. The games were on Sundays. I wasn't allowed to go. And I kind of honestly harbored that a little bit, right? I said, sure, I'll come. So when I came in, he said, here's the order of service, and here we're going to call you and this other guy named Chris up, who also sponsored, and we're going to give you a little thing. And it's like a 2-step platform up. There's no pulpit there. It's just like he has a podium or thing that he puts an iPad on, but calls up and he gives Chris his recognition and everybody claps and says thank you. And Chris sits down and he talks about me for 15 seconds and gives me a recognition and everybody claps. And as God is my witness, I go like this. May I say something? Now I'm thinking to myself, this is the rudest thing you've ever done in your life. And his answer was something like, Karen, you'll appreciate this. Sure. Anyway, I said, first of all, y'all can eat a lot of ice cream. And the whole place rumbled in laughter. I said, but really what I want to share with you is coming here, just hanging out outside in your parking lot. I could feel the love and warmth of this congregation and the church family. And I want you to know it goes, I don't want it to go unrecognized. You have something special here. And I sit down. The sermon that morning was challenging the congregation on sharing love with the community. And I texted him like that after and said, first of all, I'm sorry for speaking up. Second of all, I had no idea. He said, it was put on your heart and I know why, and it was perfect. So now, here we are. I haven't missed 4, maybe 5 Sundays since then at that church. So getting to the crux of how I got to this book. After we finished the Fritz project, Bathsheba says, I really want to do your story. And the way she works, this isn't a sales pitch by any means, but you meet once a week. We pick Tuesday mornings at 8 o'clock, and you talk for an hour. She asks questions, you give answers. She took what I had already written. We talked about it and expanded it and things like that. And I think we were meeting 2, maybe 3 months at this point in time. And she calls me on a Friday. And she said, do you have time for a quick cup of coffee? I said, sure, what's up? She said, it's about your book. Sure. We met at a Starbucks, a mile from my office. 3 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. I'll never forget this day. And she says, Doug, you have a great story. I know you don't think it's like Fritz's, but you have a great story. But everything you've written, there's this like undertone of you mentioned God. God protected me on this. God was with me on that. I know it was because of God. She goes, I think your story needs to talk about God a lot more than you're talking about it. I said, why are you asking me this question today? She says, I don't know. I just felt led. The previous Sunday, I was baptized for the first time in my life. So that was really the pivotal mark of the journey that built me, because, and then the subtitle is Self-Driven to Spirit-Led. And it is all those years when I was saying, look what I did, look what I accomplished. And, you know, I'm not saying this, I know it was all God, whether I recognized it or not at the time. You know, things were just, I had a rocky start with the first limo company with the partner, and that ended in 5 years, and I took off with it. And it just, you know, I didn't align with my partner morally, financially, you know, spiritually at all. And, you know, it was just best for both of us. But from that time, it was a lot of hard work, and the work paid off, and people came into my life all at the right time. I believe people come into your life sometimes for a season. Sometimes that season is 20 years, sometimes it's 20 days. But the right people came at the right time that really helped me through that process. And when I really started thinking about it all, and the worst thing that happened is I sold that first company for a lot of money and thought I'd never work again, and told everybody how great I was and things like that. And then one day, unbeknownst to me, um, God said, "Watch this," and He smacked me in the head, and I lost it all in just a few years. And I don't mean all like I had to live on the street, but I went from the mountain to the valley very quick. And another book I read in my life, and it's one of my favorite books, it talks about peaks and valleys. And you know, when you're on the peak, everything's good. It almost doesn't matter. But when you're in the valley, your character gets built. And I had a lot of character building periods in my life. And the good news is, as we stand here today, we don't have to do it alone. And you know, I had a huge mentor in my life, and we got along great. And he helped me in many ways. But when he turned maybe around, I don't know, my age, 65, or just a couple years before that, he got a lot more spiritual. And that's when we really started clicking, and I learned a lot from him. And you know, one of the things we used to talk about was, and I don't know, if you just want to be honest, it's okay. You don't have to say anything. But for a long period in my life, I always kind of knew, you know, God was there and He had your back if you let Him. But I kind of pictured Him as this bearded man in the sky that you could pray to, and sometimes wasn't even sure if He was listening, right? But through a lot of different things I've done and learned in my life, and this isn't true just with spirituality, but it sure fits here. You know, when something moves from your head to your heart, things change. And, you know, I'm not going to tell you I'm a perfect person today, and I'm totally, I almost wish I would have said the journey that's building me, because it doesn't stop, right? But what I can tell you is when you allow that Holy Spirit to come into your life and be part of you and what you think and what you do, you know, God gave us 2 ears and one mouth for a reason. And sometimes when we hear things, it creates this thing where it creates thoughts. Thoughts create emotions, and then emotions create actions. And if you don't have the first part right, where it's getting into your heart, you know, I'm a perfect example. You're going to fly off the handle a little sooner than you should. You're going to say the wrong thing to someone who's hurting. You might not even think to share, you know, what God can do in your life. And look, one of the things I say, and you're picking up on it today, I'm not a preacher, and I certainly don't profess to be one. I will lose any theological debate, even with any person in this room, I bet. But here's what I know: I've had a great life, even when I was down and out, and God was always in control, and I just didn't recognize it. And the sooner we recognize it, the sooner we can deal with it. And since this book came out, I mean, we released a couple other books, you know, way before this. And they're great books, and they're great stories, and God has touched on, and every touched on, like my other book was going to be touched on in all those books. But I am actually kind of, you know, blown away is the wrong word, but I'm very surprised of the feedback I'm getting. This book isn't out that long. As a matter of fact, I'll tell you, when I had little kids, we planned a cross-country motorhome trip from the time they were like 6 and 8 years old, and they're 30, 32, and 34 now, I believe. Um, I had a motorhome. We did little trips. We had the big map on the refrigerator going out the north, coming back to south. We're going to stop here, 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 all the little dots. And as they would think of something else, we'd add a stop. We just planned and planned and planned that trip. And then one day I realized we've been planning this thing for like 10 years. What happens? Kids grow up. They don't want to go with their parents anymore. They get married. They have their own kids. But at some point in time, the map came down. Did anybody ever get a TripTik from AAA? Back in the day, they used to print TripTiks. We had the TripTiks and all the sites we were going to see in a box under the dining room table. One day I realized, hey, the map came down. TripTiks are gone. And I sold the motorhome like a while ago. So last year, my wife says to me, this is since we're getting, we live in a 3,500 almost square foot house, and we're going to take a 35-foot motorhome and go across country. That's an experience too. But we have grandkids now. She says, I want to take the grandkids camping, and I want to start to travel. We're not getting any younger. And on June 29th, we left our driveway and went. It was supposed to be 27 days, but we went like 22 days cross country and back. Her dad's 93 in California. She didn't, long story, it's in the book, but it wasn't always the best thing there, but she wanted to see him and let him know she loves him no matter what he's done in his life. And another relative in California. And then Debbie's mom had 2 stillborn twins when Debbie was like 3 years old. And her mom got real sick. And, this is a long time ago, so medical advances aren't like they are today. She just got sick and they didn't know why. Well, they figured it out. She delivered twins, but one of them probably had been, gone for several weeks before she delivered. And the other one died at birth. But she was so sick, she had to stay in the hospital for like 3 weeks. And her husband, Debbie's dad, took care of everything. And they had a burial like the next day and things like that. But she just talked about it. They knew it. Well, about 3-4 months before this trip, she had a goal. She wanted to find her sisters. And it was a long time ago. It was 1964, I believe, when they died. And she had exhausted almost every possibility. And she remembered a babysitter. Her dad was pastor in church, Southern California, and he moved to Northern California. And she remembered a babysitter in Southern California where that came from. And they were still connected on Facebook, even though they didn't talk much. And she reached out, and through a conversation, she found out. I said, "Hey, ask her if there was like a cemetery or a funeral home that sometimes churches like levitate toward one or two." And this is after we sent checks to county clerks and all over California. Oh, we'll find them. They all sent the checks back and replied, "We can't find them." They were never named. It was just Hewitt twins. That was part of the problem. Anyway, babysitter said, try Ivy Lawn Cemetery. They did a lot of burials there. She calls the cemetery on June 6th. And the lady says, hold on. Picks the phone back up. I have your sisters. She says to Debbie, you'll never guess what day they were buried. June 6th. So the same day, however many years later, she found them. So that was one of the stops we made in California when we found the graves. But anyway, I am open to some questions. I could keep talking, but I feel like I'm just rambling. I do know that, I'll tell you one more. Maybe some of you maybe even know this guy. I don't know. There was a guy named Mel Robinson who was a Atlanta bus driver, for a long time. And everybody loved him. And when I started the limo company, I actually met him when I was in high school. He was the Votech bus driver that we had because we had a woman driver, Shirley, and some of the guys gave Shirley such a hard time she couldn't do it anymore. So he came on to be the cooler. And the first day he walked in the bus, I exaggerate the story that he had to tip his head to get in, and he stood there and all he said was, "Fellas, it's over." And about halfway to Votech, there's some railroad tracks on 309, and you could smell a cigarette somewhere in the back. And I saw him. He kept looking up in the mirror. The buses have to stop at the railroad tracks, right? He stopped, and that quick he put the emergency brake on and jumped out of his seat, and he goes back about 20 rows in the bus, or 15, whatever it was, and the kid's there, and he takes a cigarette and puts it down between his legs, and he's trying to hide it. And Melvin, he was a brother, and I loved him like a brother, and he stood there, and he said, "I got all day. You about to burn yourself, But Melvin and I just became really good friends. So when I started the limo company, I hired him as a part-time driver. Anybody ever hear of the Four Tops? We got a call to drive the Four Tops, and they performed at Muhlenberg College in Allentown, and I put Melvin on it, and I had a partner at the time, and I said, let's go over to the venue and see what's going on at the concert. And we went over there, and the limo's parked there, and there's no Melvin. Security guys are, hey, where's the limo driver? He goes, look up on the stage. That night in Allentown, Pennsylvania, at Muhlenberg College, it was the Five Tops. All five of them were lined up, and there's Melvin. He was part of it. That's the kind of guy he was. And another guy who was a Christian. And there was many people in my life and crossed my path that just kept the signal alive. So for me, it was almost unfair to a point how easy it was for me to make that transition from never being in a church to really opening up my heart to the, being baptized. And, I go to a men's group thing every Tuesday night at a church, Bible study Wednesday nights. It's groups that we don't meet all year, but the minister's going through a certain thing, and then they do breakouts. And my wife, again, is like, who is this guy, right? But I know it's still early, but if you have questions, I'll answer any question you want. And I won't sugarcoat anything, but I'll be professional. Yes.
Did you bring any books with you?
Of course. Now, I really didn't come here to sell books. However, last time, I want to sign your book, Karen, too. Last time we brought Fritz books, and we gave a portion of what we sold back to the Salvation Army. We're going to do the same thing again. And I even brought some Fritz books, but I don't care if nobody buys a book, but here's what I would encourage you. You're all well seasoned, I assume, and you probably have your spirituality all in check. But if you have kids and grandkids or friends, and this is the stuff that's coming out of the woodwork for me, I start saying I'm almost overwhelmed. I have a guy that sells me something at my work, and he came in to see me the day we pulled the plug on Fritz. And I was, just not myself. And he wants to introduce himself. We had met on the phone, and he, as soon as he started talking, his name's Greg. I said, Greg, I'm going through something personal. It's just not the day. It's not you. I'm really struggling with something. And he immediately said, no problem. Now, I think people who can read a room really can get further in life. No problem. I texted him a couple of days later and told him, what happened and why. And so I texted him, and he called me. He said, Doug, I knew you were going through something. I don't know a lot about you, but I want you to know that me and my wife have prayed for you every day since I saw you. So I shared with him then when he came in, hey, I'm writing my life story, and I'd like to share it with you in draft form for your feedback. And I shared it with him in draft, and he was, I need to know when it comes out. I need to know when it comes out. So, that was part of the motorhome story. June 29th, we left. That book was released like July 2nd, and we're not even home. So for the first 20 days or so, I wasn't even around like to give it the kickoff it needed. But you know who did? God. Because just putting a little post out and people reading it. One of my brother-in-laws never read a book in his life. He said, changed, and that member, oh, I didn't tell you, but my mother-in-law died in March 25th. One of the truest angels that ever lived. And so it was his mother-in-law also, right? And he always heard the message, but he didn't understand it. And so he left me this greatest message. And it just went on and on and on from there. That's the feedback that someone else is in control of. So this Greg, I had the books out, and he bought 2 copies, one for each of his kids. They're both, one's I think 19 and one's 21 or something, both out of high school going to college. And in my book, I talk about those pivotal years where we all seem to wander, especially men, when your hormones get flowing and things like that. You're just not, necessarily in tune. And and in my life, there was things happening around me that made me get second guess. Some pastors aren't actually totally in tune either, and we'll just leave it at that. But things made me really second guess. Well, if he can do it, why can't I? Stuff like that. But the truth of the matter is, God is in control. This Greg guy, he wanted each of his kids to have it because they're in those pivotal years where, especially how many have ever had kids or grandkids go off to college, and it's a huge step. As a father, I lived through it. Luckily, my oldest daughter, she was the first one to go, obviously, but we were so close that every night at 11 o'clock, we would talk for half hour and watch The Office on TV together and laugh about it. So we had a bond, a bond beyond that, but it was nice that went as long as it did. So anyway, I even forget the question you asked. I hope I answered it.
I want to buy a book.
Okay. Oh, yeah. So we have books in the back. Do you have anything to? I think you read most of it at least, right? Anything you want to?
Yes. He shared a few of the stories, but there are many more stories that are really interesting. So I would encourage you. His journey that he took is just, you could see it was God-driven, spirit-led. Yeah. How much is your book?
It's on sale here for $20. It's $23 on Amazon or something, but we have copies here for $20, and 5 of that would come right back to the Salvation Army. So, somebody else has to have a question. Yes.
Are you retired now? I missed what you said.
I am not retired.
Well,
I don't drive. I shouldn't say I don't drive. I did a trip 4 o'clock Monday morning, but I own it and manage it and run it to this day, and the used car lot. And my dad. One thing the book really talks about. My dad and I. There was a period where we didn't get along that great. But the one thing, well, more than one, 2 things he really taught me. One was work ethic, unbelievable. He worked all the time. Now I have 5 sisters and no brothers, so I wish he would open a restaurant, not a gas station, right? But what I learned through that, and there's no judgment here at all. He wasn't around, so all 5 of my sisters didn't have the best relationships with their men in their life. So that is something I pick up on. Another thing, I just, I don't want to get too deep, and again, there's no judgment here, but I believe that God is calling everybody right now, but particularly men. It is time for men to stand up and become the leader of, I'm not saying the drill sergeant necessarily, but the leader of the house. The guidance every child needs, particularly daughters need from their dad. And, I'm not going to blame, fatherless homes for the whole problem in the world, because that's not true. It's a big part of it, but it's not true. I think, I have to be careful how I say this because I don't want to sound judgmental, but the world is a shambles. It's a shambles for many reasons. And my personal belief is it's, lack of God in general. And it's very interesting to me because I see Gen Z is the fastest growing group right now of returning to the church. What does that tell you? And I see a lot of people I never thought of, celebrities, Russell Brand, Denzel Washington, these people just all of a sudden sharing their faith, right? Amen, right? It's just, there's like an awakening happening or something. And, the world could use a lot more love in general and less divisiveness. It also could use strong leaders, particularly in a household. And kids, I think COVID played some part of that too, of not being able to go to school and things like that. Kids, as a rule, they could all use a little bit of help. And again, I'm not an expert, and I'm certainly not a preacher. But I will tell you, in every card my grandmother, or my mom's mom, every card she ever sent me, she closed it with Proverbs 3:5-6, and sometimes put the whole verse in. Just regard all your heart, always acknowledge Him, and He will direct thy paths. But that was inbred in me, and I think I mentioned the book 2 or 3 times. So thank God for generational blessings, because both of my grandparents, all 4 of them, were huge believers. The other thing about my dad, I mentioned 2 things. I'm going to mention 2. He had work ethic unbelievable. The other thing, he was not afraid to witness and not afraid to call his kids out when he didn't agree with what they were doing, to the point it caused problems sometimes. I share a story in my book. He came to my apartment on a Sunday morning. I wasn't in church. And he came to my apartment to, lecture me. And I pretended I wasn't home. And it ate at me for years. Now, I'm not going to give the story away, but we made great amends. He died very young and he was sick, and we made great amends at, the last couple of years of his life. But, thank God for parents that, that cared and things like that. I can smell the food, but is there any more? Yes.
On a lighter note, did your sister ever meet Willie Nelson?
It was my wife.
Your wife?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm
Well, we were on stage, like we were closer than you and I are to Willie Nelson, and the harmonica player was right there, but she never got to shake his hand or anything. But it was her birthday 2 days ago, and I know it's like her favorite singer in the world. And I bought her 2 Willie Nelson autobiography books. Talk about a wild life. But yeah. That was the highlight of her life, I think. Not her whole life, but as far as that goes. We went to see him a couple times, once actually before that, in York, Pennsylvania. And this is a true story, and this doesn't really matter, but the show started at 7:00. There was no warm-up band. They came right out. At like 9:30, we left and walked around the York Fair and came back like a half hour later, and he was still playing. Played like 3.5 hours that night. Yeah. I'll tell you about Little Richard, and then we'll be done. Anybody ever hear Little Richard? Music Fest. I have to look the year up, but we were driving them to Music Fest, and again, sound check. You go in the afternoon, and they practice, get all the mics right and all that. And at that time, the Music Fest used to use what was the Hilton at 9th and Hamilton in Allentown. And I picked them up, and it's a weird intersection there coming out at 10th and Walnut. It's like a 3-way, 4-way thing. And, thank you very much. And he rolls the window down while I'm at the traffic light, and there's a woman pushing a little baby in a stroller. And he says, "Little Richard loves you." This is, downtown Allentown. And she comes over, and he's talking to her like it's his granddaughter. This is, at the time, not the best lifestyle, celebrity, just talking to this woman. But that's pretty interesting. So that night when the show was at the Music Fest, I drove a lead car, and then somebody else drove a limo, and somebody else drove a van for the band. But his relative, for a long time I thought it was his brother. but I'm thinking it might be a cousin the more research I do. He was in the front of the car with me, and he was like a Bible scholar preacher guy. And he was sharing with me about life. Again, all these signals I'm getting, even when I'm not totally in tune, right? He's sharing with me about life. We're coming across Union Boulevard from Bethlehem to Allentown, and the guy behind me calls me and he says, "Hey, they're hungry." And I'm like, "Hungry?" So I said to the brother, "What should we do?" And he goes, "I don't know, what is it?" I said, "Oh, this is like 10:30 at night, right? Now, there's not a lot over here." He goes, "Well, there's a Wendy's." I said, "Wendy's?" He said, "Yeah." I thought they wanted something better. But as we pull in, the lights go out. And I said, "Oh, man, they're closing." I said, let me, remember calling the White House, right? Let me see what I can do. So I go over on the glass, and the guy, "We're closed." I said, "No, come here. And he comes to the window, and he says, "What's up?" I said, "Look, limo, van, Little Richard's hungry." They opened the door and took their orders and made their food. But while we were waiting for that, the relative, I think cousin, is just talking to me about God and life. And he actually gave me a book he wrote, and I sure wish I had that book. Now, this is 20 years ago, right, or more. And I tried Googling it, Little Richard's relative wrote a book or something, but I keep calling it with a cousin. But anyway, I saw a thing about Little Richard after he died. Does anybody know the story after he died? Or while he was almost... He gave his life to God and stopped his lifestyle. And don't quote me on this, but pretty much everything that he had, except taking care of his family, went into the ministry. People can change. I can change. You can change. So I really appreciate your time today. Do you mind if I just say a prayer quick? Dear God, I thank you for the opportunity to share parts of my story, but more importantly, your grace. Our world needs you now more than ever. I believe only you can give the total healing that is necessary. I ask you to touch every heart that heard this story and the ones they share it with, and continue to bless your word and message going out. Thank you for the Salvation Army in Bethlehem and Majors Scott and Karen as they lead and share your message with them. Now bless this food for these people because they're hungry. Amen. Thank you. We'll do the books in the back.